Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at the walls around us. We're diving into the dual protagonists of our narrative, the community-driven Chicano mural movement and the illicit, explosive rise of U.S. graffiti. Both of these phenomena completely transformed blank city spaces into highly visible canvases, but they did it with entirely different motivations and got vastly different reactions from the public.
So let's get right into our first movement. The term Chicano is profoundly tied to identity. Comedian and activist Cheech Marin actually defined a Chicano as a Mexican-American with political attitude. And the Chicano mural movement was deeply rooted in that exact political and cultural identity. It was really born out of a desire for representation, a way to firmly affirm a distinct heritage right here in the United States. Now, contrast that with our second movement, graffiti. By its very definition, is illicit. It's writing or drawing scribbled, scratched, or sprayed on a wall or surface in a public space, completely without authorization. So where the Chicano movement was all about community representation, early graffiti was inherently individualistic. It was rebellious and defined entirely by its unauthorized nature.
To really grasp how these two street-level art forms compare, we're going to look at 5 key areas today. First, the canvas of the streets. Then, roots, rebellion, and representation. Next, cultural mixing versus wild style. Followed by The Empire Strikes Back, and finally, From Subways to Sanctuaries.
Part 1. The Canvas of the Streets, two movements reclaiming public space.
While both movements essentially aimed to put art on walls, their chosen canvases reflected completely different goals for public visibility. Just think about your own neighborhood for a second. Chicano murals were purposefully placed on highly visible community hubs. We're talking churches, schools, busy intersections. They wanted to be a permanent, unavoidable voice for their communities. Early graffiti, on the other hand, started on moving targets. Think train boxcars in the 1920s and later subways and streets in the 1960s. Graffiti writers were looking for maximum exposure across the whole city. They were basically treating the transit system like a rolling gallery.
Part 2. Roots, Rebellion, and Representation, Tracing the Parallel Histories.
It's pretty fascinating to see how these two distinct artistic phenomena were evolving side by side across the decades. Both actually have early roots in the 1920s, but they experienced a massive explosion of activity in the late 1960s and 70s. For Chicano murals, this was tightly linked to the Civil Rights Movement. For graffiti, it was tied to the rise of youth culture and hip-hop in major cities like New York and Philly. And by the late 80s, graffiti faced a massive institutional roadblock.
When you look at the early pioneers, the contrast is just incredible. The Chicano movement was sparked by Los Tres Grandes, Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. These were established artists creating grand, commissioned wall art in the 1920s. But the pioneers of modern graffiti? They were urban youths. Taki 183 was literally just a foot messenger in Manhattan who started marking his name and street number on his routes. He wasn't commissioned. He was just a kid trying to get his name up as much as humanly possible.
Part 3. Cultural mixing versus wild style, the visual languages of the streets.
The motifs they used really highlight their different intentions. Chicano murals acted as deep community storytelling. You'd see Aztec pyramids, the Virgin Mary, historical figures like Pancho Villa, and local heroes. Graffiti was an entirely different visual language. It was fast, highly competitive, and incredibly individualistic. It relied on swift tags, bold bubble lettering, and eventually an almost illegible, highly intricate lettering technique that became known as wild style.
And because that graffiti scene was so intensely competitive, writers constantly had to outdo each other to go all city. Just consider the rapid escalation. It started with a simple tag, basically a signature. But to stand out, they moved to throw-ups, which were larger but still fast to paint. Then came pieces, or masterpieces with elaborate colors and 3D effects. Ultimately, this intense competition led to top to bottoms, where writers would literally cover the entire height of a subway car.
Now let's take a step back and look at the primary theme of Chicano murals. Their goal wasn't a frenetic race for individual fame. Their core visual language was cultural mixing. This was a reverent, community-focused blending of American, Mexican, and local traditions into a singular, distinct sense of identity. It was all about showing that cultures can mix harmoniously without being combative.
Part 4. The Empire Strikes Back, the Clash with Authority.
This brings us to a really fundamental question. Is it art or is it vandalism? How did cities actually respond to unauthorized marks on public walls? Well, as we're going to see, the institutional response to graffiti was a harsh legal crackdown, which contrasts pretty sharply with the way murals were treated.
The pushback against graffiti was immense. Driven by the broken window theory, which suggested that visual decay like graffiti actually invites more serious crime, cities adopted strict zero-tolerance policies. In 1989, New York City launched the Clean Train movement. They flat-out refused to run trains with graffiti on them, using harsh chemical washes, known as the buff, to dissolve the paint. Chicago created graffiti blasters for rapid removal, and some cities even went as far as banning the sale of aerosol spray paint to minors entirely.
So what drove these severe countermeasures? It really comes down to a staggering number: $1 million. That represents the annual graffiti cleanup costs for just the Chicago Transit Authority alone. The financial toll on municipalities across the country was simply massive.
And the penalties for the riders themselves became incredibly steep. In Chicago, laws mandated a $500 minimum fine per incident. In California, depending on the cost of the damage, graffiti could land you a misdemeanor or even a felony charge with years in state prison. Oregon similarly threatens up to a year in jail, elevating to a felony for damages over $1,000. The authorities definitely were not treating this as misguided art. They were aggressively prosecuting it as criminal mischief.
Part 5. From Subways to Sanctuaries, the Evolution into Accepted Art.
Ironically, the relentless crackdown on subways eventually pushed graffiti pioneers out of the train yards and straight into the established art world. As early as 1972, Hugo Martinez founded the United Graffiti Artists to present this work in legitimate galleries. By the 1980s, icons like Jean-Michel Basquiat went from spraying illicit Samo tags on the streets to painting in high-end studios, alongside peers like Keith Haring. Graffiti had evolved into what we now celebrate as street art.
Now, compare graffiti's battle for survival with the reverence shown to Chicano murals today. Because these murals reflect deep community values and local identities, they're widely protected. In fact, they are rarely ever vandalized. Many cities have fully embraced this tradition as a powerful, inclusive form of urban renewal. They aren't seen as eyesores at all. They're celebrated as community sanctuaries.
Which leaves us with a final thought for today's explainer. If both movements essentially sought to reclaim public space and give a visual voice to those who felt ignored, why do we protect one with laws and embrace it as heritage while we erase the other with chemicals and prosecute it as a felony? It really makes you wonder, who ultimately gets to decide what is art and what is vandalism? Thank you for exploring this with me today.